Hello there. My name is Sarah. I am not a historian, but today I'm going to be telling you all about the Roman Emperor Nero, who is kind of one of Rome's bad boys, at least from the reputation he has nowadays. So let's get this underway, and I hope you enjoy. So, like I said, Nero was kind of one of Rome's bad boys. He was not somebody who was lined up for power, but he managed to climb into it anyway. His reign was fraught with all kinds of intrigue, from adultery to murder, all kinds of murder, through ultimately his own suicide, and of course, an absolutely enormous fire that destroyed almost two-thirds of Rome. So I'm going to go through Nero's pedigree here, such as it was. Like I said, he wasn't somebody who was lined to inherit the Roman throne. He was not quite a nobody, but something very close to it within the aristocracy. Now, first of all, he was the great great grandson of Augustus Caesar, so he did have royal blood. However, he was also related technically to Julius Caesar, since Augustus was Julius's adopted son. That makes him Julian by adoption and Augustan by descent. So he was a member of the royal family. He did have a pedigree. However, that did not put him in line to inherit the throne. His closest royal relation was, interestingly, given his fate, Caligula, who we all know has as bad a reputation as Nero does. He was totally not evil, not at all. But you'll see that Nero, in some ways, followed in his uncle Caligula's footsteps. Again, Nero was Caligula's nephew. Caligula was brother of Nero's mother. On the left here, by the way, we have a bust of Julius Caesar, who is totally not Nero by blood or by appearance, for that matter. So Nero owes a lot to one person in particular, and that's his mother, Agrippina the Younger. Agrippina was the sister of the Emperor Caligula, and she was wildly ambitious. So even though she married somebody who was not particularly important, even though she herself wasn't somebody that ever had any chance of stepping into power, she certainly lined things up for her son, for Nero. Nero, by the way, was born in 37 CE. His name by birth, he was named after his father. His name was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. He wasn't called Nero until after he took the throne. We'll get there soon enough. Um, During Caligula's reign, he several times, in fact, there were conspiracies against him, like many Roman emperors. But one of these conspiracies, Nero's mother participated in it, or allegedly participated in it. And for that, Caligula had her exiled and took all her assets, including Nero's inheritance. So for a while there, it looked like Nero had nothing whatsoever. However, as Tacitus writes, purportedly, Agrippina said about Nero, upon hearing from a medium that one day he would have her killed, she said, "Let him kill me, provided he becomes emperor." Now we'll see exactly whether that medium's predictions came true or not. So up here you'll see two gold coins. This is the front and back of a very interesting set. These were issued after the Emperor Claudius, who inherited the throne after Caligula was in fact murdered. He eventually adopted Nero as his son and had these gold coins issued to commemorate Nero's adoption. On the left in these coins, you'll see we have Nero's head in profile, and to the right, that's his mother, Agrippina. So Claudius came to the throne in 41 CE, again after Caligula was murdered, and immediately Agrippina, Nero's mother, inserted herself into the royal household. She started having an affair with one of Claudius's advisors. And soon afterward, Claudius's wife, Messalina, was executed. Immediately, Agrippina started inserting herself further into the household with the plan of marrying Claudius. Now, this is particularly interesting since Claudius was Agrippina's uncle. That made it an incestuous marriage. Nevertheless, the Roman Senate approved it. They were married, and immediately Nero was adopted as Claudius's son and presumably as his heir, since that made him the oldest son. And this quote from Tacitus Overcome by these arguments in Nero's favor, the emperor preferred Domitius, that is Nero, to his own son, though he was but 2 years older. A law was passed adopting him into the Claudian family with the name of Nero. And this is the point at which Nero officially takes the name. Now, Nero still has some barriers to his ascension here. For one, Claudius is still alive. Moreover, Claudius has 2 children. On the left here, we have a little statue, and this is Britannicus. This was Claudius's oldest biological son. He was, as noted in the previous quote, 2 years younger than Nero. On the right, we have Octavia. This was Claudius's biological daughter. Both of these children essentially stood in Nero's way. However, Nero's adoption did put him in line as heir as the eldest. So that essentially crossed Britannicus right off the list at that point. However, Britannicus was quite popular. So when this had been done, Tacitus notes the adoption, there was not a person so void of pity as to not feel keen sorrow at the position of Britannicus. That is, Britannicus had just lost his right to inherit. There's quite a bit of pity for him among the Roman aristocracy. However, once Nero was in line to take the throne, he set about reassuring himself of that position. One of the first things that happened is Agrippina arranged for him to marry Octavia, his adopted sister. And once he had married her, he promptly started having affairs with all kinds of women. However, one of these women, a noble woman, wasn't very fond of Agrippina and very much wanted to become empress herself. However, obviously Nero was married to Octavia still, and Agrippina, Nero's mother, did not approve of the woman he was having an affair with. So Nero decided the solution was to have his mother killed, which he did. He spoke with a former tutor who recommended they engineer a ship, a self-sinking ship, that when sent into the water would immediately dismantle itself. And Tacitus writes, he explained that a vessel could be constructed from which a part might by a contrivance be detached when out at sea, so as to plunge Agrippina unawares into the water. That happened. However, Agrippina survived. She swam ashore. Of course, Nero couldn't let her live by that point because suspicion would fall on him. So he had her killed. He sent armed men after her and they stabbed her to death. Purportedly, as they were preparing to stab her, she exclaimed, "Smite my womb," according to Tacitus, essentially cursing Nero for his attack on her. This happened in 48 CE. At this point, Nero was not old at all. Now, the next people he set about killing included Octavia, his wife. Like I said, he had been having an affair with a noble woman for a while at this point, and by this point, very much wanted to marry that noble woman. So Octavia stood in the way. The only thing he could do is have her, well, first he tried to have her divorced, but like Britannicus, she was quite popular. The people wanted her back. He had to take her back. His mistress insisted that he have her killed. So he accused her of adultery and of abortion, sent her into exile, and then had her murdered. Her murder was set up to look like a suicide, although it was hardly believable. This quote from Tacitus shows you the level of sympathy that the Roman people had for Octavia. It says, and now the girl in her 20th year, with centurions and soldiers around her, already removed from among the living by the forecast of doom, still could not reconcile herself to death. Again, Octavia was quite young, quite popular. She was descended from the Emperor Claudius. She was his biological daughter, and by all accounts was incredibly virtuous and good. So her death was, in my opinion, one of the most tragic in Nero's story. Now that Nero had disposed of both his wife and mother and was living as emperor with his mistress, it became apparent that he was not a particularly apt ruler. He didn't have any military training. He had no political training. Although he did have advisors close to him, he did not particularly listen to them. He made a series of highly ill-advised recommendations to the Senate, including eliminating all export taxes, and that was shot down pretty quickly. However, he did enjoy the arts and he did enjoy chariot racing very much, to the point where he had the Olympics fixed one year to ensure his own triumph. As Suetonius recounts, Nero also drove a chariot in many places, at Olympia, even a 10-horse team. But after he had been thrown from the chariot, and put back in it, he was unable to hold out and gave up before the end of the course. That is, he fell out of the race. But he received the crown just the same. So he was so influential that he won the Olympic chariot races despite falling out of his chariot and failing to finish the race. By all accounts, he was incredibly proud of both his artistic abilities and his chariot racing. However, when tragedy struck the city, he was inevitably perhaps not up to the proper response. In 64 CE, a fire broke out near the Circus Maximus in the city of Rome. It eventually spread to 10 of Rome's 14 neighborhoods, destroyed a massive portion of the city. As Tacitus describes it, a disaster followed, whether accidental or treacherously contrived by the emperor is uncertain. Worse, and however, and more dreadful than any which have ever happened to this city by the violence of fire. What Tacitus is saying here is that there were rumors that Nero had in fact started the fire himself or through some sort of proxy. He had intentionally burned down a portion of the city and killed many, many people. It's not clear whether that's true or not. Tacitus and Suetonius and other historians had a very low opinion of Nero, and that comes through in their narrative. However, it's certainly clear that whether Nero's intentions were malevolent or not, he was certainly financially incompetent. He was unprepared for the rebuilding that the fire required. Here's some quotes here, kind of discussing whether Nero was in fact good or evil when it came to the Great Fire. He watched the conflagration from the Tower of Maecenas and exulted in the beauty of the flames, singing the whole of the sack of Ilium. This is the root of the Nero fiddling while Rome burned rumor. He was a quintessential performer, and this rumor, of course, reflects that while there was, in fact, tragedy underway, he was still performing. On the other hand, Tacitus writes that to relieve the people, driven out homeless as they were, Nero threw open to them the campus of Martius and the public buildings of Agrippa, and even his own gardens, and raised temporary structures to receive the destitute multitude. So it's not clear whether Nero was actually good or evil, malevolent or benevolent. It isn't clear what his actions actually were with regard to the Great Fire and the immediate aftermath. However, in the long run, he was financially inept, and his decision-making ultimately led to the collapse of both the Julian and Claudian dynasties. And we'll see how that happened in just one moment. So one of the first things he did in the wake of the Great Fire was to spend an enormous quantity of money rebuilding one of his palaces. The palace had burned in the fire, and he replaced it with something far larger, far more ostentatious. And this expenditure drained the Roman treasury. You can see in the background of this image, hopefully you can see it, is the octagonal room. This was one of the features of Nero's palace, the Domus Aurea. This room was, they believe, a dining room. Contemporary accounts describe a rotating dining room. It isn't clear what part of the dining room rotated, but they think that this might be the room, that there was some sort of pivot in the center of the room that allowed a wooden platform to rotate. Other features of the Domus Aurea included an artificial lake, an entire forest where there had once been a city, lots of gold, lots of jewels, lots of frescoes, tons of parties involving artists and musicians. It was kind of Nero's party house. He was very proud of it, and he spent quite a bit of Rome's money on it. The aristocracy started to despise him for it, since most of that money was coming from them. Additionally, he had the idols from the provinces, golden idols of the provinces, melted down to help pay for this and other restoration projects. He essentially bled Rome dry fiscally. So that's where things started to fall apart, and ultimately it led to Nero's suicide. What happened was, in those provinces whose idols had been melted down, whose people had been financially bled, they revolted. It started with a governor in Gaul named Vindex, who started a revolt. Nero was unable to defeat him. Vindex was ultimately killed himself following defeat in a battle, and another Roman governor, Galba, took over the rebellion. However, from there, the rebellion only grew. Galba eventually was elected emperor. The guard withdrew from Nero. Nero fled into the city where he hid with two of his companions. However, word came to him quickly that they had ordered him killed, that he had been condemned in absentia. Upon hearing this, he decided to commit suicide, although it took him a while to actually follow through with it. And in true dramatic fashion, he at the end exclaimed repeatedly, "What an artist the world is losing." So I would say if we had to characterize Nero, he was somebody that was never intended for the empire, for the throne of Rome, to be emperor of the Roman Empire. He was somebody that lacked the political and military skill set to actually fill that role. He fancied himself an artist and a sportsman. He preferred music and the arts to the role of leadership, and I think he had trouble taking that role seriously. Eventually, however, there are consequences for that kind of failure, particularly in an empire as violent as Rome's. It was not uncommon for emperors to meet their end by assassination or, like in Nero's case, by suicide. Now, following his death, there were 18 months during which Rome passed through four different emperors before the Flavian dynasty took over. Nero was the last emperor in the Julian-Claudian dynasty, so with him died two separate lines. He was a tragic figure, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.